can't fit anybody else in. I'm Dan Scrobel. You probably all know that. Probably many of you have been to the previous talks I've given. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about, as stated on the title page, the oldest buildings still existing in the village of Minocqua. And I identified 17 of them that were built in up to 1900. That was my cutoff date, 1900 or earlier. We're losing some of the residences that were built prior to 1900 or 1900 or before. There are two in this presentation, actually, that I kept in because they were torn down fairly recently, just in the last few years. I'm not going to keep them in forever, but for tonight I did, because they're significant residences in Minocqua. But we are losing them, especially the residence buildings compared to the commercial buildings. And I apologize that I wasn't able to fill the screen with the display. We're not using, in previous years, was using my own projector, and I was able to adjust it to fill the screen side to side so that it would be enlarged as much as possible. We weren't able to figure out, using this new projector from the library, it doesn't appear from the remote that we could increase the size of the projected image. Maybe before the next time we'll figure that out, or I think that it's just mounted too close to the screen and then we can't get it any larger. So I'm going to start this with the earliest building in town that I've been able to identify, the earliest existing building, and that would be the Darwin General Store. It's Lot 10, Block 2. This map of the village shows where we're talking about. It's on the corner of Milwaukee Avenue and Oneida Street. The building is still there. For years it was the 5 and 10 or the variety store. In the early years it was Darwin's General Store. It was built on one of the first lots sold in the village of Minocqua, owned by Gideon Little, Henry Schwedis, and John W. Sullivan. They bought it as soon as lots went on sale, and although there is no firm record of it, the depictions of the early years of the town indicate that it was built right away. And they did business as Sullivan and Company, the partnership, and it was a general store. They sold dry goods, groceries, clothing, boots, and shoes. This was an ad that appeared in the first issue of the Minocqua Times, an ad for their store. I have no early photos of that store. There are very few early photos of the village of Minocqua itself. That's always been disappointing. There's almost nothing from the 1890s. We really don't get photos of the village until the postcard years, which began in 1905. And so prior to that time, there just weren't photos being taken in town. People didn't have private cameras. That age hadn't begun. Cell phones didn't have cameras then, so we didn't get any cell phone pictures. And the postcard era didn't begin until 1905. So even when the postcard era began, there really weren't any pictures taken of the Darwin General Store. This one I estimate to be about 1920. It doesn't show A.O. Darwin, it shows Martin Rouche, who worked for A.O. Darwin for years as a clerk in the store, and his son Milan. This shows the inside of the store, probably about 1910. The store itself was only 22 feet wide. It was on a 25-foot lot, but there was a 3-foot exterior stairway going up the north wall of the store. So that limited the width of the store to 22 feet. It was originally built only 40 feet long. And in this photo, we have A.O. Darwin here, and his father, Oscar Darwin, sitting there, and their son Mylan sitting here. So the store was heated by this stove. There was no central heating. This may, in fact, have been taken in 1911 after the municipal power plant was started, because there are electric lights here. We did have some lighting, some electric lighting in Wisconsin, not in Wisconsin, in Minocqua in the early 90s, starting in 1894, but that lasted only about 6 years. I don't think this picture is that early. This picture is probably after the municipal power plant was started in 1911. So really, this date is more like 1912 probably. Now this is a later photo after the store had been remodeled and had in central heating. So we don't have the wood stove anymore. In this photo, we have Mylan Dorwin here, Martin Roosh, A.O. Dorwin, and this is Gus Nolan, who owned the Northern Resort. So here's a later photo, 1932, showing the store. This, of course, is after the fire. We've got brick buildings, and there were 4 frame buildings remaining on this end of the block after the fire of 1912. But O'Leary owned this building. His hardware store was in it, and he rebuilt this building in 1929. He tore down the old one and built a new. And at that time, at the time of this photo and beginning in 1925, the A&P grocery store was in that building. This building was moved in 1938, moved over on West Milwaukee Avenue, and a new building built there. We'll be seeing photos of it here. This is the new building. A&P around 1940 is still in that location. So this new brick building was built in 38, and then in 39, the A.O. Dorwin General Store, which is still inside this building, it was faced with brick and built to match, the front was built to match the store next door that Dorwin also owned, and that was built the year before. So the original frame building is inside this yet. The building, like I said, originally, when it was built, extended only 40 feet back. That went back to here. And then there was a 25-foot extension. And then in 1903, the building was they dug a cellar under it and put it on a stone foundation. None of the commercial buildings and residences in town prior to about 1900 were built on any stone foundations. Everything was built on what you would call a stringer or a beam, either logs themselves or a big squared off beam that was cut at a sawmill and was laid on the ground, and the building was built on top of that. That's how all of them were, including this store, which was put on the foundation in 1903. And at that time, then there was an extension built all the way to the back here. Now this part of the building was built in 1911. It was added on as a butcher shop. Initially, and Theodore Maidenwalt was the butcher, and he initially worked for A.O. Dorwin, but beginning in 1917, he took over the butcher shop himself as his own business instead of working for Dorwin, and then he continued with that being his own business. And here's a current photo of that corner. The next one that we have is the Bolger building. Now this one, I've got 2 locations for it because it was moved. This has appeared in previous talks. So the first location for it was here on Front Street, across from the current location of the parking lot for the Minocqua post office. So it was on this corner, and it looked like this. This is a picture of it on that corner. one of the very early photos that we have in Minocqua. This building was 50 feet wide this way and 60 feet that way, and of course, I mean, an imposing or substantial building. It was built by Sherman Bardwell. He never lived in Minocqua. He never had a business in Minocqua, but he was a real estate investor from Plainfield, Wisconsin. And he bought the lots 1 and 2 and built this building right away. According to what Cap Ray described, Cap Ray was a good source for early history of Minocqua. According to his stories that he told, and he wrote some articles for the Lakeland Times in the 40s. He said this was one of the first buildings built in town. It was built probably by the end of 1888. Minocqua, the railroad was completed onto the island of Minocqua in December of 1887. That is, the steel rails were built onto the island. The bridge across the lake was not completed to the point that it would support a locomotive. So locomotives didn't start running into town until mid-January probably, and they regularly scheduled ones started about January 24th. So that's the timing that we're talking about. The village started basically in January of 1888. And so by the end of 88, this building was probably built. Now, Bolger Brothers came to town in 1891. I'm sorry, A.J. Bolger came to town in 1891. Then in 1896, he was joined by 3 other brothers, T.M., P.B., and M.J. And they bought the store business that was being run, the general store that was being run in this building in February of 96. The upstairs were used for residential use, so probably the store owners lived up there or other people. This building then was purchased by the Bolger brothers in June of 1901. So they were just leasing it prior to then. Now this store building, I should point out, was actually where A.O. Darwin first was involved in a store in Minocqua. He came to Minocqua in 1891, and he became a partner with T.I. Laughlin, who owned a general store here. He was a partner with T.I. Laughlin until Laughlin, for some reason, bought out A.O. Darwin in 1894. Let's see when he returned. Yeah, in fall of 1894, Darwin was bought out. Apparently, that buyout agreement included a non-compete agreement, a 1-year non-compete, because Darwin was not involved in operating a general store and in fact moved back to Sparta for a year. And Darwin then returned exactly a year after he had been a partner, after he sold his partnership interest in this store, and then he bought a partnership interest in the one that we were looking at before that later became the Darwin store. And then Darwin became sole owner of that operation in 1896. Or 1896, he bought the real estate and was still a half partner. In 1897, he became the full owner of the store business. And so he owned it for the rest of his life from 1897 on. I didn't point that out when we were looking at that store. So on this one, after Bolger's owned this store, they decided, and at the time that they built their new store, they were still tenants in this building. They decided to build their own store building. So, well, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead too much. Let's cover the moving of that store. So after they bought that store building, they decided to move that building to this corner. And probably the reason they did is that when they moved it in 1904, they had already built their own general store building here. And after building the general store here, they moved their general store operation to their new building. And this building they retained control over, and in fact then bought the building. But I think they did that to prevent anybody else from opening a general store in that building, because it was a great location for one, and so they wanted to control their competition, and so they kept ownership of that building. And in 1904, after 4 years after having moved their general store over to Oneida Street, they decided to move this building over here, so it'd be just a couple doors down from their general store, their grocery store. So in 1904, they moved that building from Front Street to this location. Now, we're looking at Oneida Street here and at the intersection with Milwaukee Avenue. So this is the first block down from Front Street on the west side, on the east side of 51 or Oneida Street. At that time in 1904, there was a livery stable here. Now, that livery stable was there for only 8 years. It was moved to this location in 1896. Prior to 1896, Doyle and McGonagall's livery stable was located one block east on the corner where the Lakeland Times office is now. And then in 1896, Doyle and McGonagall moved their livery stable building. This building was moved to this corner. So now in 1904, the Bolger brothers purchased this livery stable and decided they wanted to move it across the street, across Milwaukee Avenue to the opposite corner. So they did that. The buildings got moved around a lot back in the old days. I'm amazed. And they weren't just small buildings, because the one that we were talking about, the 50 by 62 story building, was moved. That's what we're going to see. So this livery stable was moved across the street in the summer of 1904, and then in September of 1904, this two-story building that had been over on Front Street across from the post office was moved to this corner. And then they rebuilt the 8-foot porch in front of it. In the process of moving it over here, they also rotated the building by 180 degrees, because this front now faces west. In the previous location, this front of the building faced east. And they placed this building, interestingly, 8 feet back from the sidewalk, just like they built this is their general store, and we're going to be looking at that later on, because I'm taking these in order, and this one was built in 1900, so it'll actually be the last building that we look at in this series. This one is one of the earliest buildings, so that's why we're talking about it now. But both of these buildings, the store building and the building that they moved, were set 8 feet back from the sidewalk. And then they enclosed, by 1924, when this picture was taken, they enclosed that porch, so it had screens on it. T.M. Bolger and his family lived on the second floor of that building. As soon as they moved it over there, Thomas M. Bolger and his family lived on the second floor. And they did for the rest of his life. His name is Thomas Murtaugh, or was Thomas Murtaugh, T. Murtaugh. So that's where the name of the bar that's now in that building comes from. Here's a photo of the building that shows the south side of it, and the porch during a parade about 1928. This is Charles Headflyer from Lac du Flambeau. This is the Island City Band playing. In the Indians from Lac du Flambeau, there was a lot of socialization and financial connection between the two places back then. And the Indians partook in our 4th of July parades, and so it's different from what you might see now. Charles Headflyer, by the way, was 7 feet tall. He was, this is, he lived until the mid 30s, I believe. He was nearly 80 years old. He was about 80 years old at the time of this picture, about 1928. But he owned a farm. He had a dairy farm, and he was physically very, very active and physically in good shape until his death in the mid 80s. Now, in 1936, Bolgers extended the front of their building 8 feet and closed it. And you can still see that evidence of that extension when you go in T. Murtaugh's and look at the ceiling. You will see a support 8 feet back from the front of the building, and that indicates where the building originally ended. But it wasn't too difficult to extend it 8 feet. They just, had to build a new front wall, and the supports were extended out to the front wall. They did a brick face on the bottom and changed the top to the old old English or the Tudor style. So that was done in 36. This photo is later, of course, you can see from the age of the vehicles on it. I'm going to go back to that older one. At the time of this photo, the business that was in this corner, the prime location, the south one half of the building, was the Cozy Corner confectionery store, soda fountain and confectionery store. It was in there for about 20 years. It closed in let me check that year. Closed in the fall of 1930. And so then in the spring of 31, Rexall drugstore was opened in that part of the building. And that became Carl Krieger's drugstore, Carl's Rexall Pharmacy, in 1936. It was Brownie's Rexall Pharmacy prior to 36. And then in 39, though, Carl Krieger moved the Rexall Pharmacy into the O'Leary building, and we'll see that later. So it moved out of here in 39. And then starting in 39, or beginning in 39, there has always been a bar in the south half of the Bolger building. Now it's occupied by T. Murtaugh's, which occupies the whole north and south half. But in the early years, it was just the south half that was occupied by a bar, and they had other businesses in the north half. The first bar to locate there was called the Dry Dock, and it was operated by George Jacobs. Here we've got a 1971 photo of it. Well, I think maybe it looks like there are awnings there. This part at the back was added in 1941, and that's when the Minocqua Post Office was back there. It moved to that location beginning in 1941. And I believe it remained in that location until the new building was, the current post office building was built in the early 70s. And there's a more recent photo of it. I don't think that they made it look better. It looked a whole lot better then in 88. It looks pretty dreary in this picture. So here's one that everybody's familiar with, the Belle Isle, or the Landmark. It originally was called the Minocqua House. And this one, we don't have to estimate when it was first built. It was documented, not in a Minocqua paper, because its construction preceded the publication of the Minocqua Times, but its construction was noted in a Wausau paper. And in my research prior to doing my book, I had gone through all the newspapers in Wausau and Merrill, and Rhinelander prior to 1891, looking for information that they may have had about what was going on in Minocqua. And they did note the construction of the Minocqua House on this corner. So here's Oneida Street in front and right kitty corner from the depot. It was a prime location. So, and prior to this construction in May of 1889, there had been a small bar on this corner. But this was built in May of 1889, May and June. They just built the north half of the current building that's on that site. And it didn't extend as far back as it does now. And it was called the Minocqua or the Minocqua House. There aren't any good pictures of it. This is really the only photo that shows it. I'm sure this picture was taken while just the north half existed. If the photo had been shifted over a little more to the right, we could have confirmed that, but I have no doubt that just the north half of the building exists at the time of this photo. Then in 1893, the owners, Selleck and Rogers at that time, added the south half of the building. Now, when the Minocqua House was opened in 1889, it was the 6th hotel in Minocqua. The other hotels we had the Lakeside House on that corner, the Lakeview House here on the lake by Frank Reamer. That was Pat Madden up there. Then we had the Briggs House here, and the European House here, and the Union House here. And then that was added. So those were the 6 hotels in Minocqua in 1889. In 1904, they built a porch on it, and by this time they had extended it. They extended it to the rear because in the original pictures, we had the window up here, and then there were 6 windows. So the back of it was here, and then they added on. And again, at the time this picture was taken in 1908, although you can't see it at all, but this south half extended back only 28 feet. It had 25, after the south half was added in 1893, it had 25 sleeping rooms. Oh, and interestingly, in 1896, a private sewer line was laid from this hotel, and it went east down Front Street to the swamp that is at the east end of Front Street. And the east end of Front Street, as we know it now, didn't even exist then because that area was so low and swampy. But that's where their sewer line for this hotel ran. In 1929, the Cook brothers, Charles and Alvin Cook, bought the property from the Bolger brothers, and they renamed the business on the first floor, the restaurant and bar, though it was nominally a soft drink bar. They renamed it the Belle Isle. So this picture is about 31, not too long after the Cook brothers took over. Here's the Union House Hotel right here. It'd be nice if that would be our oldest building in town, if it still existed, because this Union House Hotel first was constructed on the railroad depot grounds on the north side of the railroad tracks. Right away after the train tracks were laid to Minocqua onto the island in December of '87, then the Union House was built by P.J. O'Malley on the north side of the tracks. And it wasn't until 1891 that he moved this building, again a rather imposing 2-story building, moved it from the north side of the tracks to his lots right behind the Minocqua House. And that was called the Union House. In 1936, that area of the south half of the building was extended back beyond the 28 feet initially that was built, and it was bowling alleys. So bowling in the late 30s and 40s and into the 50s was a big activity in Minocqua and Woodruff. And so in 36, the Belle Isle built bowling alleys. Then it was in 35 that the appearance of the building was changed to this, to look like the Tudor or Old English. So there was some brick on the first floor and then the Tudor style above. That was the first building. This was the first building that adopted that style. And it was followed a year later by the Bolger building that we looked at. It really didn't catch on around town, and that's probably good because it really didn't make sense for the North Woods. It's interesting. Let's watch from 1940. That's how the building looked. 1988, 48 years later, that's how the building looked. Really, no difference. And then 2025, 37, another 37 years later, it still looks the same. There is no significant change in the exterior of that building between 1940 and 2025. Okay, next we come to a store on Main Street. And it's now Otto's Beer Garden, so that places it for all of you probably. It's in the middle of the block here. There are no good early photos of that store. This is the earliest photo that I've seen that shows it at all. It's pointed out by the arrow there. At that time, this whole block was wood frame buildings. In 1907, that is. And here's the Darwin building. This looks at it from the train depot side, from north of Front Street where the tracks were, and we see the building there. Now, this is what got destroyed in the fire, and just 2 years after this photo. The fire came down, destroyed everything on Front Street, and then made the corner and burned down to the Doherty building, where the arrow is. So we'll see on the next photo. The fire was stopped at the Doherty building, fire on May 31, 1912. So that building survived, and the 3 additional ones to the south of it. The Doherty store was a dry goods store and sold touristy things, but it was also an Indian trading center. Mrs. Doherty sold a lot of Indian goods, Indian handmade goods from Lac du Flambeau. And she would in fact have, during the day in the summer, have Indians working on things in the store.
Did they just trade?
I don't know whether she was likely to pay them in cash, I would think, but maybe there was some trading going on too, because she would have things in her store that they might want. Now, John Doherty died in 1907. They had started their store here in 1901. Elvina Doherty, continued operating the store for years. After that, she eventually got remarried about 10 years after her husband's death, and was then Elvina Wagner. Her son, they had a son named John. Her husband was John. They had a son named John, and he was a forest ranger. And interestingly, he was working up at the Trout Lake Forest Station in 1912, shortly after the Wisconsin workman's comp law went into effect. And Wisconsin was the first state in the country with a workman's comp law. That was a new invention. And he got killed by a falling tree. He didn't get killed outright. He lived for about a week after getting um, crushed by a falling tree, and he ended up dying. And his mother was deemed to have been a dependent of his, and she ended up being the first person to collect in Wisconsin under the workers' comp law. Here's a photo of a couple of weeks probably after the fire. It shows the Doherty store here. This small building was the Evenson brothers, who had a hardware store, Minocqua Hardware Company, and that was a temporary building that they put there. So this picture about 1917, and it's dated pretty closely to 1917 because there's a building missing here that was built in 1918 in between lot lot 2 and lot 4. So I know that this is prior to 1918. Here is the Doherty store. We still have 4 frame buildings here, wood frame buildings. This store, owned by O'Leary, was torn down and built out of brick in 1929, and this one was moved in 1938 and a new store built there. This picture is taken during the outdoor exposition and Midsummer Festival. That was in 1932, and the new brick building of O'Leary's is here. The A&P store is in it. This is a 1971 photo. The building has been made kind of blah. I don't know what was in it in 1971. I don't think it was the Greenleaf store yet, or at that time yet. That opened later. Now at this time, this would be what the Greenleaf shop looked like. This is 1988. So it was, they really improved, went back to closer to what it looked like in its early years, got rid of the square front and the plain siding. And so it looks much nicer, and actually that's its appearance now. Here's what it looks like now, or 2016 when Otto's went in it. Now we'll look at a residence, probably one of the first residences built in the village. Camilla Daniels. Camilla and her husband DeLoss started a general store while the railroad was being built to Minocqua. Their general store was across the lake, south of the railroad camp, and it was a wood frame building that they built. They didn't want to have their store right in the mess of the railroad camp, where there was a lot of drinking and guys were living in tents, and so they built their store to the south where the Beacons Resort is now. And they also had a small residence there too. And then as soon as the railroad was completed onto the island that winter, they dragged their store building across the lake on the ice to here. So where that appears is where their store was located. Now, shortly after moving the store here, her husband, DeLoss, died. But she continued operating the store, and she, in fact, her store became the first post office in Minocqua, and she was the first postmaster. Now, initially, she and her husband were traveling back and forth between their store here, going across the lake to their residence on the west shore. they didn't move their residence building here. And the thought that they had is Cap Ray related, is they knew that all that land on the west shore of the lake was part of the water reserve lands, and that it would be coming on market in not too long. And they were hoping that having their residence there would enable them to make a claim on the land. As it turned out, though, the rule for the water reserve lands was that if you were claiming as a settler on the land, you could not be settled on the land prior to December 10, 1890, when the lands went up for settlement and for filing claims. So that didn't work out for them. And they undoubtedly got tired of making that trip across the lake between their house and their store. So that's why they were one of the early ones to build their residence here on the corner of Chicago Avenue and Oneida. There's a gas station there now. That was where they built their residence, I would guess, right away in 1888. By the end of 1888, they had built a residence there, so that they were they had just a short walk between their residence and their store. There are no early photos that show their residence. This is the earliest photo I've come up with that shows it even in part. So this is the Camilla Daniels residence on that corner, probably about 1948 during a 4th of July parade, or this could be a Memorial Day parade too. Now in 1950, the residence was moved from the front of the lot to the rear. Art Darwin owned the property at that time, and he built a gas station. He moved the residence to the rear of the lots and built a gas station. It became the Anderson gas station. And so these are pictures were taken in 2016. This would have been the original house. And then the house, then there was a north wing built on it. This house was turned 90 degrees when it was moved to the rear of the lot. So this part of the house faced Oneida Street when it was right on the corner. And then about 8 years after the house was built, then a second floor was added here. And interestingly, this, like every other building, this house was not built on a foundation when it was in its original spot, and that had to be added later. They were having to dig cellars out and build stone foundations under all these early buildings. Every early building that I've talked about was not built on a stone foundation. Well, Camilla Daniels closed her store in 1902 and left town, so she sold this. And it went through a couple ownerships and then ended up being owned by Sophia Boileau. John Boileau, she was a widow. Her husband had died. And he had owned a business up in Woodruff. He was a businessman in Woodruff more than here. But she bought a house as a widow. She bought her house in Minocqua. Her son became well known in politics in Wisconsin and was a judge in Wisconsin. Gerald Boileau. And unfortunately, this house, I've included it because it is one of the first residences built in Minocqua. It doesn't exist anymore and will have to be removed from the program probably the next time I give it. It was torn down about, I don't know, I didn't make note of when it was torn down. It was torn down for the extension of the garage, probably about 4 years ago, I would say. Then we come to the F.M. Bunye residence. Now this one was located on Front Street on the corner that in later years became a Texaco station. Now is Bangstad's brewery, his bar. This is where F.M. Bunye built his barber shop on that corner. He was Minocqua's first barber, Here is the building that he built. Cap Ray relates that the first election in Minocqua, before we had a town hall, the first election was held in this building, and they the people had to hand their ballots in through a window, and the election officials were inside this building. So this was a story and a half building. F.M. Bunye and his wife lived on the second floor for the first couple of years. He was the first barber in town. Then by about 1890 or 91, he built his house at the rear of the lot. So he had his store, his shop up front. His house was built on the rear. This is the original part of the house. This was added on. I don't know when this addition was built. But this house is gone. Here's where it was. It was torn down about 3 years ago. Marcus Doyle residence. This one is right across the street from the museum on this corner. You recognize that. This is, although it's from '88. That one has an interesting story. Marcus Doyle was a contractor in town, a carpenter, and his house was built from the lumber that was taken out of the first schoolhouse in Minocqua. When Minocqua was established, there was no road heading south from Minocqua. Hazelhurst didn't exist when Minocqua was the first year that Minocqua was established, and certainly when the Platte was established, there was nothing to the south. And if you were headed somewhere to the south, you were going to be taking the train out of here. So there was no anticipation that there would be a bridge crossing the lake and a road heading south. So that was fine initially. There were no settlers on the south, to the south of Minocqua when it was established. But when the water reserve lands were opened up for settling for claims in December of 1890, that was a real popular area. In fact, one of the best properties in the area was on Bolger Lake that A.J. Bolger claimed. And so there were a lot of claimants down there. Schlecht, McNutt are two names that survive to this day. And and it wasn't just the one settler per claim. What happened, and what the water reserve lands would probably make a good topic at some point in a talk, but I've not gone into it because it's more of a written topic than a pictorial topic. I don't have a whole lot of photos that would depict it. I do have some photos of homesteads that were built, the small cabins, but there wouldn't be too many pictures attached to it. So anyway, there were a lot of, you could claim the land by filing a claim at the U.S. Land Office in Wausau, starting the morning of Saturday, December 10, 1890. And I think that office may have opened at 9 o'clock. And so then you'd file your claim. But there was also a theory that you could establish your claim by settling on the land starting December 10 of 1890. And so a lot of people did that rather than going down to Wausau to file a claim. And they figured they're gonna beat the filers because they settled on it at 1 minute after midnight on December 10. And so they would be there before the filers. And there were a lot of disputes between filers and claimants. And so there were for example, the Bolger property had, Bolger was a filer, and there were 3 or 4 settlers on his land. And that was typical for all the better claims around here, that there was a filer and several settlers on it, all battling it out. And you'd think that there was probably people getting killed in gunplay. There reportedly was nothing like that, and the claimants usually worked things out among themselves about who was going to get it. There were disputes that had to be decided by the land office. So there were all these people settled south of Lake Minocqua, and not just one per claim. It was typically three people or families per claim. And so that was December of 1890. So then, when the fall of 1891 came around, we have all these children south of the lake that need to go to school. And we don't have a bridge over the lake. Um, After all these settlers started in the sun, were established down there, the town of Minocqua did start running a ferry across the lake in the spring of 1891. Yeah, spring of 1891, so that there was a way for all those people to get into town. And Marcus Doyle was, in fact, the person operating the ferry for the town. And then also in the fall of 1891, we had these kids down there, and the town decided to build a rural schoolhouse 2 miles south. It was located along what is now Highway 51, and um, Carrie Dorwin, who was a teacher there, she was Carolyn O'Leary, was her last name, her maiden name. She was a teacher there, and in her later years, she described that it was located about where the road turns off of 51 to go to the town dump. Now, when she was relating that, the town dump still existed. Now that's been closed down there, and that's the roadway that goes into the zip line business. So right about there, where the zip line road or roadway turns off of 51, is where the first Minocqua rural schoolhouse was located. Well, so that was needed for the term of 91, 92, and 92, 93. But in the winter of 92, 93, a bridge was built. The first bridge across Lake Minocqua was built. And that was completed by the spring of 93. So after that, it was much easier for school children to get onto the island to go to school here. So they discontinued that school. And the town hired Marcus Doyle to tear down the schoolhouse. This is a long story to talk about the construction of this house, but no wonder my talks take too long. So he used the lumber, he was free to have the lumber. He used the lumber to build this house. And it was his house at the time. That was built in 1894. Now, the fire that destroyed Minocqua began in the the lakeside house immediately behind his house. At this time, it was no longer owned by Marcus Doyle. He sold it in 1906 to John and Mary Mann. John Mann and his wife owned the Manitowish Lodge, which in 1915 was purchased by Cardinal and became Cardinal's Lodge. So anyway, at this time, this is the Mann residence, and it did not get damaged by the fire. There was like a west southwest wind at the time of the fire that blew it this way. So that's the Mann residence, and here is the Dorwin residence, which of course is where the museum is now. It's Dorwin Park. So it must have been ironic for Mrs. Dorwin, who was the teacher. A.O. Dorwin married Carrie O'Leary when she was a teacher at that school south of town. So she lived in this house right across the street from this house that was built from the lumber from the school that she taught in. So this is a current photo of that house. It's been kept up really well. Ben Stobin residence. Now that one is here on the corner across the street from the Lakeland Times office. So here's Oneida Street and Milwaukee Avenue, Chippewa. This is what it looks like. This is the original part of the residence. Ben Stobin was the blacksmith in town. In the spring of 1895, he built his blacksmith shop on the south end of his property here. And then in the summer of 1895, he built his residence here. And then shortly after, and I don't know why, initially he didn't have it on a foundation. Within 2 years, he decided to dig a cellar under it and put it on a stone foundation, and he added this addition at the same time. So that was just a couple of years, I think it was 1897 that he did that. And his residence was next to the F.M. Bunye residence. And on this south end of that lot is still vacant. That's where his blacksmith shop was. And it still is vacant. Here's a current photo of that yard. The Charles Smack residence. Now we'll shift over to another part of the town here along the lake. Charles Smack residence was on lot 14, block 9. And he built that in let me check. I think it was 1895. Yes, 1895, the summer of 1895, he built the residence. We do have a fairly early photo of this one, kind of coincidentally. This is a photo taken on the dock in front of what would later become Bisacki's, but that would be 20 years from when this picture was taken. And it shows the Charles Smack residence here and the Catholic Church. Charles Smack also owned a farm up on Johnson Lake. So it maybe didn't have a winter residence or he wanted to live in town, and he built in Minocqua rather than in Woodruff. In 1895, though, that would have been understandable. Woodruff wasn't much of a town yet in 1895. So he built here, and this is what it looked like in 1994 and currently. So it's still being used, still being kept up. Then we get to the Titus residence. Now this one was built in spring of 1896, not by anybody in the Titus family. It was built by Hall and is located here behind, on the block between the Marcus Doyle residence. The museum is here, Marcus Doyle residence, and then the Darwin building, the Darwin store building. So it's got 3 lots. It wasn't built by anybody from the Titus family. It was built by Hall and Foster, who owned a bar on Front Street at the time. So it was built in 1896. So it's we've advanced one more year now in age. It was built in 1896. They built it for their own use, but they sold it in 1901 and went through a couple ownerships. This house too was not built on a stone foundation. In 1903, a cellar was dug and the stone foundation was put under it. It became the Titus residence in 1912. I've mentioned that the town had a municipal light and power plant. And that was located on Front Street where the American Legion post is now, across from today's post office. And Sarah Titus lived in the house next door to the power plant. And she complained about the fumes and the noise coming from that, and it probably was a valid complaint. She ended up, because the town wasn't doing anything to satisfy her, she ended up suing the town for property nuisance. And the case was settled by the town buying her residence, and then she used the money to purchase this residence on Milwaukee Avenue. And then this residence was in the Titus family for many years after that. She bought it in 1912. In 1933, she deeded it to her son, Dominic Titus. And Dominic Titus was the town clerk in Minocqua for many, many years. And Dominic Titus was the father of Tuffy Titus and Edward Titus that some of you may have known personally. This picture is perhaps, I should have taken one from the other side. This is a little deceiving, makes the building look smaller than it is because there is an addition towards the rear of the building. There is an addition that extends to the west side. But overall, it's not a large place. And it has, the second floor is just a half story. Then we come to the Charles and Ivy Carmen residence. So initially it was the Jewel Josart residence, one of the Josart brothers. Jewel Josart actually was the brother of David Josart, whose house was here and who started what eventually became Bisacki's. David Josart started Josart's boat livery here, and that would eventually become Bisacki's. So he lived there on the corner. So his brother was Jewel Josart, and that house was located here. There are no early photos of it other than this area, what I could find on this aerial photo taken in 28. Here's the residence on Park Avenue. And there it is just 10 years ago. Now this was built in 1897, and in 1918 it was sold to Charles and Ivy Carmen. This wing was built quite early. It was built in 1896. Let me check that. I'm sorry, 1906. So this was the main residence or initial residence built in 1897. In 1906, this wing extending to the west was added to the property. So that addition is quite old. Charles and Ivy Carmen were in Minocqua for many years. Charles Carmen worked for the railroad. He was a conductor on the train to Minocqua and retired that as an employee. Ivy Carmen was active in town socially. She and Mrs. Torpy started a book club in Minocqua in the late 1900s. I'm sorry, 1909, 1900s. They started a book club. If you belonged to the book club, you there was a collection of books kept on a porch, and it could have been on Ivy Carmen's porch, or it was kept over at the Dr. Torpy residence. And you could borrow the book and read it and then take it back and exchange it for another one. So you had to pay to be in the book club. And that lasted for about 20 years. And then in 1929, after we had a community building, the current community building that's kitty corner from the Lakeland Times office, after that was built in 27, then they had more space to have a public library, and a Minocqua Public Library was begun in 1929. And Ivy Carmen was the first president of the Public Library Board. And we come to a combination residence and later commercial property, built in 1898. This one's on lots 3, 4, and 5 of Block 9. This is the earliest photo of it. It was built in 1898 by the Catholic priest. It was his personal residence. It was not owned by the local church. It was the Catholic priest's personal residence, and when it was built, it was probably the largest residence in Minocqua. He lived there for only 2 years, left in a kind of in a very quiet manner, because the circumstances seemed to be rather mysterious. Most descriptions of it state that he had a nervous breakdown and left town. And so then Sister Margaret Walsh, which Margaret is misspelled there in the ad, she bought the building in the fall of 1900, and then in the spring and April of 1901 opened a hotel, the hospital, called the St. Augustine Hospital. It was a private hospital. That's actually the Sister Margaret and her hospital was the topic of the first talk that I gave here at the library 2 years ago, and it's a real interesting topic. I may in fact repeat it next year because it's an interesting talk. So here is her 1906 ad. She hired physicians. At this time, she had a Dr. Warden was her physician, a resident physician. She started off um, on very good terms with, like Dr. Torpy was here. And Dr. Torpy began sending patients to her, but that didn't last very long. She would antagonize people. She fought with people all the time. She had a real difficult personality, it's obvious. And that's would come out more when we cover that subject in a future talk about her and about the hospital. So she had Dr. Warden at this time. She went through physicians fairly frequently. They couldn't stay with her. This is a different physician standing in front of the building, probably 1908. This picture is about 1912. And in the background here is the P.B. Bolger residence. So that residence stood in what later would be the parking lot for the Bolger Funeral Home. It was on that corner. And it's a big residence because P.B. Bolger and his wife had 12 children. But after he died in about 1918, she moved out of Minocqua. And then their residence became the Gordon Hotel. Helen Gordon bought it, and it became a hotel. And here's a more recent photo. This is what the building looks like now. It was the Harold Scrobel and Danner Law Office from 1984 to 2025. Next, we've got the J.E. O'Leary residence, also near the museum, kitty corner across the street from the museum. So it's on this corner. Museum's here. For some reason, the construction date of this residence was not noted in the Minocqua Times. They were pretty good at noting, who was building, who was adding on, who was digging a cellar and putting a foundation under. But I don't know of any indication of when this was built. I do know that at the time it was built, the property was owned by Sherman Bardwell, the investor from Plainfield, and he built this residence, and then he sold it to A.O. Dorwin. Dorwin bought it for his brother-in-law. See, remember, Dorwin married an O'Leary. His wife was Carolyn O'Leary. Her brother, J.E. O'Leary, moved to Minocqua in 1900 and moved into this residence. And then he bought it shortly after that, he bought it from Dorwin. But after moving in, he turned the residence. It wasn't on a foundation. The front of the residence originally faced Flambeau Street. And O'Leary turned it, about a year after moving into it, turned it so that the front faced Milwaukee Avenue. And then he built an addition on the back, this part back here. And it was in 1909, at least 10 years after that residence was built, that finally a cellar was dug underneath it and it was put on a stone foundation. March of 1900, we're getting close to my cutoff date. Herman Mulang built his residence in March of 1900. It's across the street from the Heritage House, not almost directly across the street. This is the residence. His brother Albert had a residence that looked much the same on the adjacent lot where Island Cafe is now. So this was built in March of 1900. It went through a series of ownerships until Sidney and Minnie Bailey's bought it in 1927. Bailey's owned Minocqua Plumbing and Heating, and he operated his business out of here. In 1936, the house was extensively damaged by a fire, but didn't burn down. They didn't tear it down. They fixed it, and I think it was probably in the process of redoing the interior of that residence that they maybe built this shop at the front of the residence, because that was built in the 30s, and I'm guessing it was built after or during the process of rebuilding the house. So that's 1936. In 1947, Ray Jelinski bought Minocqua Plumbing and Heating and bought this house. He lived here, he and his wife, and they operated Jelinski Plumbing out of the front shop. There's a more recent photo of it. So that's still there. The Schlecht residence. Now you may think of the big Schlecht residence, but this isn't. This is next door to the big Schlecht residence. It's here in lot 1 of block 13. But it's a smaller residence. It was built first. It was built in 1900 by C.W. Rose. He sold it to William Schlecht in 1901. And then in 1902, William Schlecht married Ruth Klein, and the two of them lived in this residence until, and here's a more current photo of it. It's really overgrown in the front. I didn't take one recently. I don't know if they've cleared those out. It's really overgrown, but here's the big residence. This was built in 1906, and that's where William and Ruth Schlecht moved into after that was built. The Ben Stobin Carpentry Shop, also 1900. And that's next to the Ben Stobin residence, and it was next to the Ben Stobin blacksmith shop when it was built. Here it is. And there's Spangs that's no longer there. So this Ben Stobin got into woodworking, and so he built a separate shop for woodworking. It was right next door, and his blacksmith shop was on this lot. The Minocqua Museum, well, after Ben Stobin used it as a carpentry shop, so did George Abraham. He leased it. He did woodworking in it, but he discontinued that in 1904. There was no indication of any use of that building until 1934, when Joe Crow moved his jewelry shop into it. And Joe Crow was in there until the 50s, I believe. And then in 1987 and 88, the summers of 87 and 88, the Minocqua Museum operated its sampler museum in this building. And I couldn't find a photo. I thought I had some photos taken, in fact, even with Helen standing in front of the shop, Helen Brumel, but I couldn't find them, and I got to add that at some point. The last one, this is the Bolger Brothers General Store, built in 1900. It's the first brick building in town. So it's in this picture, taken about 1902. It's this building, built in 1900. They immediately moved their general store into that from the location across from the post office on Front Street. The Bolger brothers got into financial difficulties around 1920. By 1920, they were having financial difficulties. They were subject to foreclosure actions. This building was subject to foreclosure. They did transfers of real estate to their sisters and other people in the family and friends to try to protect it. And then finally in 1925, they leased the store because they were no longer operating. They leased the store to A&P. This was the first location of the A&P grocery store that opened in the summer of 1925. But then in the fall of 1925, J.E. O'Leary bought this store, and he moved the A&P store across the street to his building that where I previously showed the A&P store that was owned by J.E. O'Leary, that building. And so he moved the grocery store over to his other building, and then he fixed the interior of this one up and used and occupied it as his hardware store. And then in 1935, he decided to rebuild entirely, and there was at the time there was a vacant lot to the north of the Bolger store, and a vacant lot to the south of it. But O'Leary owned the store and that vacant lot to the north, and so he built a new building to the north, and right here, and extended the front of the original Bolger store 8 feet out to the sidewalk. So it looked like this. So the original Bolger store building is inside this building, but because they didn't tear it down, they just built around it, extended the front of it 8 feet to the sidewalk, and the original store building was 30 feet. So this new building is divided 30 feet and 22 feet. It covers, well, it may cover 52 feet. So it's the original store building straddled 3 lots. It was on lot 13, but it crossed over onto lot 14 a little bit, crossed about 5 feet onto lot 12, because at the time the building was built, the Bolger brothers owned all 3 of those lots. I don't know why they built it in the middle like that. You know, it seems like they should have built it right down to their north line and built 30 feet across, leaving the rest of their 3 lots all intact in one piece. But they didn't do that. So anyway, O'Leary, this was the O'Leary building. After he rebuilt that, he had his hardware store in the south half, the larger half, and a furniture store in the north half. So that was what was going on at the time of this picture in 37. And here you can see this 37 photo, about 37, the Carl's Rexall Drugs in the south half of the Bolger building. 1971 photo, Hanson's Hardware, which started out in Manitowish Waters, opened its first Minocqua store in this location where O'Leary was. Now, by the time of this photo, Bolger's had reacquired the properties down to the midpoint or near midpoint of the O'Leary building. So from this point over to the corner, by 1988, was owned again by the Bolger family, and still is now. And there's a recent photo of it. So that ends our pictures of the oldest buildings in town.
Thank you.
Any questions? Yes.
When they put the stone foundations in, was it just a crawl space type, or did they make full?
I think they made full basements. Yeah.
To be sure they didn't want to move it around somewhere.
Yes, in the back.
Where's the Masonic Temple?
When? 1927.
It's in so many old pictures all by itself.
Yeah. In the back.
When the big fire took place, and all the buildings are wood, how come, in spite of the way the wind was blowing, how did they save any of it?
Well, I don't know how they saved the buildings on down Oneida Street to the end of Block 2, where the Darwin store would have been burned too. I don't know how they managed to do that. There has never been a good description of how they stopped it at the Doherty store. Well, it wasn't a south wind; it was a west. And yeah, with all that heat, you would think, and it did burn its way down that block too. For the first 6 lots, it burned its way down Oneida Street to the Doherty store, but somehow they stopped it there.
So it started on the very west end and then worked
Yep,
towards Main
on the
Street.
northwest end. Yes.
How did they actually move all of those buildings?
I've never seen a picture.
You said they dragged something.
Well, they had to do it on log rollers and horses, but geez, to build, that 50 by 60 Bolger building, that's a lot of weight. I don't know how many horses you'd need because they didn't have diesel tractors to pull these things. They were doing it by actual horses. So that's a lot of weight to pull. You'd think there'd be some pictures of it. I've never seen a photo.
You think there are other towns in Wisconsin that have that many buildings moving around?
I don't know.
I mean,
I'm not done with this town. I haven't started studying another town yet.
That little blue house that you said ended up as a Louis.
Yeah.
There's like a historical sign says it was used as a blacksmith shop. So it sounds like it got maybe used with the one.
The blacksmith shop was next door, and it was used as a woodworking shop.
There was a jewelry store until early 80s.
Yeah.
Grundy's Jewelry.
Oh, it became Grundy's?
Grundy's Jewelry, yeah. Grundy's Jewelry were there.
I don't know the 80s.
It was great, yeah. It was, jewelry store for a long time.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. As usual, I went over.